The smell reached him before the light did. He was still pulling on his boots when it came through the gap beneath the cabin door. Something heavy and fermented, almost wine-dark in the nose. Sweet the way overripe things turn sweet just before they turn to rot. He thought at first it was the creek running different, or some animal dead in the brush. Then he stepped outside into the pale gray of a September morning and stopped moving entirely. The eastern edge of their property, the long flat stretch between the hay barn and the creek, was buried. Mounded from wheel rut to wheel rut, piled chest-high in places, spreading nearly 40 yards along the fence line, were apples. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, bruised yellow and rust red, and the deep brown of a thing already surrendering. They lay in drifts, like some impossible orchard harvest dropped from the sky. The wagon tracks were still fresh in the soft ground, cutting deep. 8 loads at least, maybe more. Someone had worked through the night to leave this here. She came out behind him, pulling her shawl tight, and the two of them stood at the edge of it without speaking for a long moment. 6 miles north, the Callaway operation ran 400 trees on good irrigated ground. Commercial men, absentee owners, foremen who made decisions with ledgers rather than shovels. Every autumn they culled their drops and their frostnicks and their bruised seconds, anything too ugly for the rail market. Hauling that waste to their designated pit cost money. Leaving it on a struggling homesteader's boundary line, in the dark, cost nothing. There were no words written, no note, no apology, just the tracks, and the smell, and the quiet certainty of who had done it. He walked the length of the pile with his hands at his sides. She followed 2 steps behind, and when he stopped, she stopped beside him. Neither of them had the heart to speak the obvious aloud, not yet. What they were both doing, she could see it in the set of his jaw, and he could see it in the stillness of her hands, was arithmetic, the kind that doesn't need paper. 6 weeks. That was all that stood between them, and a $47 banknote that would take the deed with it if it went unpaid. 2 dry summers had seen to the grain. A collapsed fence and a neighbor's wandering cattle had finished what the drought began. The kitchen garden had given them enough to eat, barely. Bess, the milk cow, gave them enough to barter, barely. Barely had been their word for 18 months, spoken or unspoken, hanging over every meal and every morning. And now their land smelled like a cider press. He bent down and picked up a single apple from the edge of the nearest mound. It was dense in his hand, hard-skinned, firm despite its bruising, tart-smelling when he pressed his thumb into a soft spot. He did not throw it away. He turned it in his palm, the way a man turns a coin he's not sure is real. Then he set it down carefully on the nearest mound and picked up another, then another. He moved along the edge of the pile the way a person walks the perimeter of something they're still deciding how to feel about. She did not move at all. The fury had come up in her fast and quiet, the way creek water rises, not with noise but with a steady, unstoppable will. 8 wagon loads. She had counted the ruts in the grass, the tracks of the wheels pressed deep by weight, and she knew what it meant without being told. The Callaway operation, 6 miles north, had hauled their waste to the edge of someone else's land rather than pay to dispose of it properly. They hadn't asked. They hadn't left word. They had simply come in the night, or the gray of early morning, which was nearly the same thing, and unburdened themselves onto people who were already burdened enough. She stood with her arms crossed and felt something bright and useless moving through her chest. It was the feeling of being counted as small, of being the kind of people whose land could be used that way, because what were they going to do about it? He was still walking. He'd gone perhaps a third of the way around the largest mound by the time she found her voice. "We'll need the wagon," she said, "to haul it off." He didn't answer immediately. He crouched beside one pile and pressed an apple between both hands, turning it, smelling it, then another. The skin was mottled and dark in places, split in a few, soft around the bruises, but when he found a clean spot, and pressed hard with his thumbnail, the flesh beneath resisted. "Most of these are still firm," he said, mostly to himself. Emmett, his name and her voice carried all of it, the fury, the grief, the exhaustion of being people who kept being asked to absorb things. He stood and looked at her across the mound. His expression was not grief, it wasn't anger either. It was the particular look he got when he was turning a problem over, finding its edges. "They're acid sharp," he said, "dense. The bruising is surface, most of the flesh underneath." He paused. "These didn't rot, they got cold. There's a difference." She said nothing, waiting. "I keep thinking," he said slowly, "about my grandfather's cellar, the barrels he kept." He set the apple down and looked across the full length of the mounds. "A man can do something with fruit like this, something worth doing." The morning light was coming fuller now, and it caught the mounds in a way that almost made them look like something other than a problem. She uncrossed her arms. She didn't agree yet, but she was listening. He went to the almanac that evening. It lived on the shelf above the stove, a thick, water-warped volume from 1871 that had made the journey west with her father's wagon and arrived with its spine already failing. He'd consulted it for planting dates, for frost predictions that turned out to be wrong, for the small comfort of believing the future was knowable. Now he pulled it down and turned it slowly, page by page, not entirely sure what he was looking for. She was at the table, mending a harness strap, the lamp pulled close, her needle moving in and out of the leather, with the quiet persistence of someone who has learned not to waste movement. She didn't look up, but she was aware of him the way she was always aware of him, the particular weight of his attention when it fixed on something. The page fell out from between the weather tables for October and November. He caught it before it reached the floor. A single sheet, folded twice, covered on both sides in handwriting that was not the almanac printer's, small, cramped. The ink faded to brown at the edges. Someone had tucked it there deliberately, or perhaps just forgotten it. He unfolded it carefully, the way you unfold something that might not survive the opening. He read it once to himself. Then he carried it to the table and set it beside the lamp. "Come look at this," he said. She set the harness down. The page described a two-stage process. First, the pressing of juice from tart, acid-rich fruit into fresh cider. Then the slow conversion of that cider through a second fermentation, guided by a living culture called the mother, into genuine cider vinegar. The handwriting was practical, not poetic. Measurements, temperatures, timing, the particular importance of keeping the barrels in a space that stayed cool but never froze. Someone had done this before. Someone had thought it worth writing down. He read it aloud to her, slowly, pausing where the handwriting was difficult. When he finished, neither of them spoke for a moment. She was the one who got up first. She went to the barn door, opened it, and stood there in the dark, counting on her fingers. He followed, bringing the lamp, and they stood together in the barn's smell of hay and old wood, and went through what they owned. The hand-crank press sat in the corner under a canvas, her father's, built solid, the iron gearing stiff but intact. 6 oak fermentation barrels stood along the north wall, emptied after the failed grain year, their staves still tight. 3 lengths of cheesecloth hung on a nail, ceramic crocks. A cast-iron stove with an oven that could hold temperature if you fed it carefully. He held the lamp higher. The list of what they had was longer than the list of what they lacked. "We're missing the mother," she said quietly, still reading the page. He nodded. That was the part neither of them yet understood. They started before the sun was up. She had slept maybe 3 hours, lying still beside him in the dark with her eyes open, running through the steps the almanac page had described. When she heard him pull on his boots, she was already sitting up. No discussion needed. They dressed in the cold and went out together into a morning that smelled of wet earth and the sweet rotten weight of 1,000 pounds of fruit waiting at the fence line. The sorting came first. That was the rule they set without formally setting it. Waste nothing, but be honest. Each apple had to earn its place. She worked one end of the row, he worked the other, and they moved toward each other through the pale early light, turning each fruit in their hands, judging by smell and give, and the integrity of the skin. Anything with the core gone soft went back to the ground. Anything still holding its density went into the wooden crates he had knocked together the night before from spare barn planks. The Roxbury russets were strange fruit, hard-skinned and dense, almost homely, their russeted surfaces rough as old leather. But when you pressed a thumbnail through and brought it to your nose, the smell that came back was sharp and alive, more vinegar already than sweetness, as if the fruit had been practicing the transformation on its own. She told him that. He laughed, which felt good. The cold had reddened both their faces. By mid-morning they had 3 full crates sorted and carried to the barn. He set the hand-crank press in the light from the open barn door and spent 20 minutes working oil into the iron gearing with a rag until it moved without grinding. Her father had built it to last. It lasted. The pressing was hard work, the kind that reaches into the shoulders and stays there. He fed the apples into the hopper and cranked. She held the cheesecloth taut beneath the press plate and guided the flow into a ceramic crock, then poured each crock into the nearest barrel. The juice came out cloudy and pale gold, almost white in the shadow of the barn, and the smell that rose from it was extraordinary, sharp, wild, almost electric. It filled the barn entirely. It followed them when they stepped outside. It soaked into their clothes. They did not stop for a proper midday meal. She brought hard biscuits and he chewed one while he cranked. They traded places twice, and each time the one who took the handle made no complaint, only found their grip and continued. The second barrel filled slower, the apples more bruised, the yield thinner. They adjusted. Shorter batches, more pressure, longer hold. By the time the light was going, they had pressed through 4 crates and filled 3 barrels with cloudy, breathing cider that shivered faintly in the lamplight. His arms ached down to the wrist. She had not mentioned hers. The waiting was its own kind of labor. With the barrels sealed and the press set aside, there was nothing to do for the cider but let it breathe and work in the dark. 3 barrels of pale, cloudy juice, each one alive in its own quiet way, fizzing almost imperceptibly at the bungholes, exhaling the faint, sweet, sour breath of something becoming. He pressed his palm to the nearest stave and held it there a moment. He could feel nothing through the wood, no heat, no tremor, and yet he trusted the almanac page, trusted the smell, trusted the simple fact that this was what juice did when it was left alone long enough in an oak barrel. It turned. That was the nature of it. She used the stillness. While he moved to the root cellar and assessed what needed doing, she set herself at the small table near the stove with a collection of materials she had gathered quietly over the previous days. A stub of beeswax she'd kept in the sewing tin, a half-inch of tallow saved from the last candle rendering, 2 sheets of brown paper from a flour sack, and a small tin of lampblack mixed thin with linseed oil that served, when she applied it carefully with a split twig, as a passable ink. She worked slowly, deliberately, cutting the paper into even rectangles and lettering each one in her careful hand. Haskell Farm, Laramie Valley, cider vinegar, 1884. The letters were small and straight. She had been a good student once, and it showed. She stacked the labels and melted the beeswax and tallow together in a tin spoon held over the stove's edge, watching until the mixture went clear and still, then tested a drop on the back of her hand to judge the temperature. She was planning for bottles that did not yet exist, for a product not yet finished. She did it anyway. It was the only kind of hope that felt honest, hope that had work attached to it. Outside, he was on his knees at the root cellar door with a mallet and a flat-bladed spade. The door had been sagging on its lower hinge for months, scraping the earthen threshold, letting in a thin seam of wind that would ruin a cold storage situation come hard freeze. He reseated the hinge with a longer wooden peg, driven tight, planed the scrape off the door's bottom edge with a hand draw knife, and then traced the water line along the cellar floor where spring runoff had once pooled. He cut a narrow drainage channel along the north wall with the spade, 6 inches wide, sloping gently toward a gravel sump he filled with creek stones hauled in a bucket. The work took the better part of the afternoon. That evening they sat together near the stove. She showed him the labels. He set one flat on his palm and read it twice without speaking. Then he nodded once, which was enough. The barrels were working in the barn. The cellar was dry and ready. 3 weeks in, she was the one who found it. She had gone to the barn before first light, lantern in one hand and a folded cheesecloth in the other, meaning to skim the foam off the nearest barrel, the way she had done every morning since pressing. The routine had become muscle memory. Lift the coverboard, lean into the sour, sweet smell rising up from the dark, check the color, check the smell, move on. But that morning she set the lantern on the barrel's edge and looked down and stopped breathing. Across the surface of the cider, pale and trembling slightly with its own inner life, lay something she had never seen before. A mat, a skin, rubbery, opaque, faintly iridescent at the edges where the lantern caught it. It covered the cider from stave to stave, like a creature that had settled there in the night and made itself at home. She did not touch it. She stepped back. Her first thought was mold. Her second thought was that they had lost everything. She checked the second barrel. The same mat, thinner, just beginning to coalesce at the center. The third barrel showed only a faint clouding at the surface, a whisper of the same thing coming. She stood in the cold barn with her breath making small clouds, and felt the 6 weeks collapsing behind her like a bridge giving way, plank by plank. She went to the cabin and woke him without a word. The look on her face was enough. He carried the lantern. She followed. He stood over the first barrel for a long moment, then crouched, bringing his eyes level with the mat's surface, studying its edges where it met the stave wood. He pressed one finger gently to its edge. She nearly pulled his hand back, and felt it give slightly. Resilient, continuous, not crumbling the way mold would. He went back to the cabin. She heard him at the shelf where the almanac lived. She stayed in the barn, keeping watch over something she did not yet understand. He was gone long enough that she began to count her heartbeats to keep calm. When he came back, he had the page. He held it near the lantern and read it slowly, tracing each line with his finger, the way a man does when every word costs something. She watched his face. She had learned to read him in the spaces between expressions, the small flicker of his jaw, the way his brow moved when a thought shifted from fear toward something else. The brow shifted. He read one passage twice. Then he looked up at her over the lantern flame, and what was in his face was not relief exactly. It was something more careful than that, more earned, recognition. The almanac had a name for what was floating in their barrel. It was not spoilage. It was not death. It was the thing that would do the work. He read the passage to her twice more, his voice low and steady in the lantern light, the words moving through the cold barn air like something deliberate. The almanac's writer, whoever he had been, whatever valley he had worked in, described the mother not as an accident, but as a guest, a living thing that arrived when conditions were right and converted alcohol to acid through nothing more than time, air, and its own quiet industry. It needed oxygen. It needed warmth enough to work, but not so much that it cooked. It needed the cider to be still beneath it, while it stretched itself across the surface and did what it was made to do. She asked what happened if they disturbed it. He said the page wasn't entirely clear on that, but it used the word fragile once, and he said it like a warning. They looked at each other across the barrel. 6 barrels in the barn, and only the one had caught the culture on its own, drawn it in through the bunghole she'd left loosely stoppered, breathing. The other 5 were sealed tight and cold and waiting. The work of the next 2 days was the most careful either of them had ever attempted. Not the hardest. There had been harder things. Fence posts driven into frozen ground, a calf turned wrong in the dark. But the most careful. They used a wide wooden ladle, cleaned with boiling water, and dried until it held no smell at all. They skimmed the mother from the first barrel in long, slow passes, transferring sections of the gelatinous mat to each of the waiting barrels, laying the pieces flat across the cider's surface, as gently as she had ever laid anything down in her life. She found herself holding her breath at the moment of transfer, and had to remind herself that the thing was alive and did not require her silence, only her steadiness. He did the aeration by hand, drawing a wooden paddle in long, slow arcs just beneath the surface of each barrel, not breaking the cider into foam, but moving it, waking it, letting air work into the liquid the way the almanac described. 10 minutes to a barrel, patient, methodical, the kind of labor that felt like nothing from the outside and cost everything from the inside. They unsealed each barrel only briefly, transferred what was needed, and stoppered them again, loose enough to breathe, tight enough to hold the warmth. By the second evening, the barn had changed. It was not sudden. It crept in the way weather does, a shift in what the air carried. The sweetness of pressed cider was still underneath it, but something older had come to the surface now, sharper, more certain of itself, the smell of a thing becoming what it was always meant to be. She stood in the barn doorway and breathed it in, and for the first time since the wagons had come, she did not feel like they were losing. The cold came without announcement. He stepped out before supper to check the creek, and came back moving faster than she had seen him move in weeks. The door swinging hard behind him, breath clouding in the lamplight. She knew before he spoke. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since midday. The sky to the north had gone the particular gray-white of a sky that means what it says. By morning there would be frost, not the gentle rhyming kind that settled on fence posts and burned off by noon, but the hard, killing kind that drove itself into the ground and stayed. She looked at him. He looked at the barn wall. They did not discuss it. There was nothing to discuss. He took the lantern and went. She fed the cast-iron stove until it breathed orange through every seam of the door, then pulled on her coat and followed him into the dark with an armful of wool blankets they had been saving for their own use. The cold hit her face like creek water. The stars were ferociously clear, the kind of clear that means no cloud cover, no mercy, nothing between the land and the frozen vault of sky. In the barn, he was already moving bales. The hay they had cut and stacked along the east wall had never been meant for this. But hay holds what heat there is, traps it in its fibers, the way a woman folds a sleeping thing into her arms. He stacked bales 3 deep against the north wall and 2 deep along the west, working by lantern light, and his own instinct, the mallet swinging to wedge them flush, no gap for cold to thread through. She followed behind him, pressing loose straw into the cracks he left. Then, the blankets, layered over the barrel ends, tucked and weighted, the wool smelling of cedar, and a winter 2 years past. Each barrel wrapped the way you wrap something you cannot afford to lose. She tied the corners down with strips of feed sack so the wind could not breathe them loose in the night. He stood in the center of the barn and turned slowly, reading the walls the way a man reads weather, looking for weakness, for the place cold would find its way, in the way cold always finds its way in. He found 2. He packed them with his own coat. She went back to the cabin and fed the stove through every hour of the night, sleeping in the chair beside it, waking at each settling of the fire to lay another piece of wood on the coals. The cold pressed against the cabin walls like something patient and deliberate, but inside the stove spoke back to it, steady, faithful, unrelenting. Dawn came gray and still and glittering. She pulled on her boots and walked to the barn, and lifted the first blanket with her breath, held behind her teeth. The barrel was warm beneath her palm. The barrels held. 3 of them. 4. She checked each one in the early light, pressing her palm flat against the staves the way you press your hand to a feverish forehead, listening through the skin for what the eyes cannot see. The mothers were still alive. She could feel it in the faint give of warmth, in the smell that rose when she lifted the corners of the cheesecloth, sharp and working, alive with that particular tang that was no longer cider and not yet fully itself. Something becoming, something still in the middle of its long, slow transformation. But the cold had changed the counting. The freeze had cost them 2 days of optimal temperature, and 2 days on a calendar that was already stripped to its last pages meant something different now. She did not say it until they were at the creek. He had gone down to break the skim of ice at the bank so Bess could drink. She followed without knowing quite why, only that the cabin felt too small for the thought she was carrying. The creek moved quietly under its thin sheath, black water finding its way around the new edges of ice, patient and indifferent to everything above it. She stood beside him and watched it, and then she asked the thing she had been holding back for days, whether they had only invented a beautiful way to lose. She did not dress it in kindness. She asked it plain, the way you ask the land a question, without expectation, without softness, because the land does not reward softness, and neither does a banknote. He was quiet for long enough that she felt the cold move through her coat. The creek spoke in its small way. A rook crossed above the cottonwoods and was gone. He did not look at her, and then he did. He had no easy answer. She saw him searching for one, saw him turn the question over the way he turned a tool in his hands before use, checking for what it could and could not bear, and she loved him for not pretending one arrived. He reached for her hand instead. His fingers were cold, so were hers. He said they would finish what they started. Not because he was certain, not because the numbers had shifted in their favor, or because the barrels had whispered guarantees through the cheesecloth in the night, but because a thing begun in this much good faith deserved its conclusion, because they had pressed every bruised apple they had been given, because stopping now would not return a single day. She held his hand. The water moved beneath the ice. Somewhere in the barn the vinegar was becoming what it needed to become, and outside the sun was pale and low and the banknote had 2 weeks left on it, and they walked back up the bank together. The cold came in hard that Thursday, and with it came the smell. He noticed it first when he lifted the barn latch, a sharp, bright bite in the air. Not rot, not sweetness, but something older and more purposeful than either. He stood in the doorway with his breath clouding before him, and understood before he crossed to the barrels. He pressed his palm flat against the nearest stave. He pulled the cheesecloth back. He dipped the tin ladle and tasted. He set the ladle down. He went to find her. She was at the stove, and she read his face before he spoke. She pulled her coat from the peg and came without being asked. In the barn, she tasted it herself, tipped the ladle back, held it on her tongue, and her expression shifted through several things before it settled. Tart, clean, real, not finished as she imagined finished should taste, but close enough that the gap between here and there was a matter of days, not weeks. They had not expected this. The almanac page had promised 6 to 8 weeks of secondary fermentation. The cold nights had pushed the high-acid fruit through faster than any written estimate. She counted forward, and then backward, and then simply stopped counting, and looked at him, and said they had better start. The racking took most of that day. He siphoned each barrel carefully, drawing the clear amber liquid off the settled sediment below, transferring it through doubled cheesecloth stretched across the mouth of the ceramic crocks. The sediment held. The mother had done its work and sunk cleanly, and what came through the cloth was the color of late autumn honey, held up to the window glass. She took charge of the filling. 43 bottles, each one pressed into her hands, each one tipped with precision, so nothing spilled and nothing was wasted. He poured, she held. They did not speak much. The barn was cold enough that their breath showed, but the work warmed them. He melted the wax in the small tin pot over the camp stove set up in the corner, and she dipped each cork in turn and pressed each bottle to the shelf he had nailed along the root cellar wall. By the time the pale light failed, they had moved inside. She sat at the table with the lamp pulled close and wrote the labels in her clearest hand. The date, the valley, their name, the variety. She pressed each one to its bottle with the flat of her thumb. 43 bottles stood in rows on the shelf by nightfall, wax-sealed, labeled, amber in the lamplight. Outside the wind had come up. She did not look out the window yet. She kept her eyes on the shelf and let herself breathe. Tomorrow the buyer might come, or he might not. He came the last day of October. She heard the wagon before she saw it. Iron wheels on the frozen ruts of the road. The slow, deliberate creak of a team not hurrying. She was at the creek rinsing the cheesecloth when the sound reached her, and she straightened and looked north. A bay horse and a roan pulling a covered freight wagon, canvas sides snapping in the cold morning wind. A man alone on the bench, wearing a dark coat and a felt hat with the brim turned down against the weather. She walked to the cabin and told him. He came out wiping his hands on a piece of grain sacking, and they stood together in the yard and waited. The man on the wagon set his brake and climbed down carefully, the way a man does when his knees have given him trouble long enough to account for it. He introduced himself without ceremony. Aldous Fitch, Dry Goods and Provisions. Cheyenne? He said a freighter passing through had mentioned the smell coming off the property 2 weeks prior. Strong, he said. Clean. Not the smell of rot, but of something working. It had stayed with the freighter long enough that he'd mentioned it in town, and the mention had reached Fitch, and Fitch had decided the detour was worth his time. He asked to see what they had. They took him to the root cellar. He ducked through the low doorway, stood upright in the cool dark, and looked at the shelf without speaking. 43 bottles in their rows. He picked one up and held it to the light that fell through the open door. The color seemed to satisfy him. He worked the cork out with his thumb, brought the bottle to his nose, and breathed slowly. Then he tasted it. A small amount on the back of his hand, the way a careful man does, who has been deceived by appearances before. He held the taste in his mouth for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. Neither of them spoke. He set the bottle down on the shelf with a gentleness that surprised her, and he turned and looked at them both in the dim light of the cellar, and he said the price he was prepared to pay per bottle for the full lot. Then he said he wanted the same quantity doubled for the following autumn, and he would put that in writing before he left the property today. The number he named for the full contract was enough to cover the banknote. It was enough to cover it and leave something besides. She looked at him, her husband, and he was looking at the shelf, and she could see by the set of his jaw that he had heard the same thing she had. Fitch replaced his hat and said he would wait outside while they talked it over. They did not need long to talk it over. She said yes before he finished his sentence, and he laughed, a short, surprised sound she had not heard from him in months. They shook Fitch's hand at the wagon and watched him copy the terms into his ledger, in careful block letters, the scratch of his pen the only sound beside the wind. He tore the page cleanly along the ledger's edge and handed it across. Her husband folded it once and tucked it inside his coat, close to his chest, the way a man carries something he intends to keep. Fitch drove north before noon. They stood in the yard a moment after the wagon rounded the far bend, not saying anything, watching the dust settle back into the grass. The banknote was paid the following morning. The snow came 3 days after that. Not a dusting, but a true first snow, the kind that means it. She was already at the south fence when the flakes began, setting the last of the 12 young saplings into holes she had dug herself the previous afternoon, tamping the loose soil firm with her boot heel, packing straw around each base for warmth. Her hands were cold. She did not stop. Each tree went in straight, staked with a cedar post, and tied with a strip of feed sacking. 12 trees along the south fence, catching the long winter light, the beginning of something that would outlast this season. He was in town when she finished. He returned in the early afternoon with the deed extension filed, and signed and stamped. The county recorder's mark pressed into the paper, like a small promise from the territory itself. He did not say much when he got home. He handed her the deed, and she read it through once. The official language plain and irrefutable, and then she set it on the table beside the almanac page she had smoothed flat that morning. That evening they pulled the plank door of the root cellar wide and stood at the top of the stone steps without going down. The bottles lined the shelves in the lamplight, 43 of them, their wax seals dark and even, her handwriting on each label in steady ink. Snow drifted past the opening and caught the amber light as it fell. She went inside and came back with the deed box, the cedar one, brass-latched, her father's. She folded the almanac page along its worn crease and laid it inside, beneath the deed, beneath the contract. Not as a curiosity, as a record, as the first page of what this farm would become. He pulled the cellar door gently closed against the cold. They walked back to the cabin together, through the new snow, and the light was already going, and the land was theirs.